They get to this by trying to make art, and Duchamp even says this, that isn't art, right? They're trying to make an anti-art. And he's sort of inspired by things he's seeing in other venues, like the propeller that he saw at the air show. You know, can we make anything more beautiful? Art is dead, right? And we need to move on. And so he makes these works that are just problematic, right? A window that you look at instead of through. Or a window that you can't even look through. Works of art that are found objects that he does nothing to, but sign them and change their original purpose to something else. Signing works of art with stencils instead of by handwriting, right? These are all sort of making a problem out of what authorship means. Copywriting it, right? Putting a copyright on it as if somebody else is going to reproduce it, but lo and behold, all he ever did was come up with the idea. It was made by a carpenter and a shoe leather manufacturer, right? A cobbler. That's who made the work. He didn't touch it. And indeed, there are 4 or 5 versions of this thing, right? MoMA's got one as well. So it's this idea of copyright is somehow also kind of weird, right? It's questioning the role of the artist and the importance of that. That traditional idea of art making in the modern world has really been rendered very, very problematic, right? And we'll see as we look at other Dada artists in New York and elsewhere that this is an ongoing question, right? An ongoing issue, and a hugely important one as we move down, right? And you know, Arp was doing the same thing by not touching it, by having chance enter into it, right? Okay, another Dada artist in New York. Good friends with Duchamp from a long time back is Francis Picabia. And going back to Duchamp's days in Paris, remember he started in Paris, moves to New York in 1915. They were both part of the Golden Section group, right? The Section d'Or that had that great, huge Cubist show, right? Quasi-Cubist show in 1912 that launched the Orphist group, right? That was a sort of a subsection of this. And we really focused on the Orphists, right? Well, Picabia is also in that Paris suburb of Puteaux, alongside Duchamp, alongside Delaunay, Juan Gris, right? Who else? Villon, Kupka, right? All the people that we looked at when we talked about the Orphist group. They're there as well. And in 1912, at the Golden Section show, these 2 works actually hung side by side. They were literally, like you see them here, next to each other at the Golden Section show. And each of them are doing a sort of personal take on Cubism, right? So Picabia's work is meant to be a religious procession. I think that the orange parts across the front are meant to be monks in procession. But at the same time, it's Cubisted, if you will, right? Rendered in a Cubist manner in a way that solidifies everything. Everything looks like they're facets of some sort of gemstone. And takes it further away from representation, right? Again, like Duchamp, because they're friends and working side by side, Picabia is also interested in, like the Futurists were at the same time, capturing motion, which is something you really don't see in Picasso and Braque, right? Their things stand still. But for Picabia and Duchamp, things move, right? And what we'll see is that this is a fruitful sort of interchange between the 2 of them, because at this point, Duchamp is much more sort of out there in a way, in that he's interested in changes of psyche, changes of identity, right? The passage from the virgin to bride. Picabia is not quite there yet, but what we're going to see is that, in fact, Picabia's work ends up having a very profound influence on Duchamp as well. Some of Duchamp's ideas seem to bounce off of Picabia because the 2 have this long-standing relationship. In 1913, these 2 works hung side by side again in New York at the famous Armory show, which I wound up talking about in one of those makeup lectures, right? The famous Armory show of modern art in New York, right? So they were there as well. And of all of the Cubist or Orphist artists that were exhibited in that show, the only one that came to the show was Picabia, right? And he shared in some of the negative reaction that Duchamp got, right? He came with his wife. He ends up going back to Paris and kind of comes back and forth and back and forth. And both him and Duchamp end up moving to New York permanently at around the same time in 1915, right? So when Picabia settles permanently in New York, he abandons sort of this quasi-offshoot cubism that he'd been doing. And he turns to machine imagery. He loves machinery. And he loves sort of mail order catalogs, right? And he starts to make copies of things he sees in mail order catalogs and advertising. And they're very, very precise copies, right? Very, very sharp in their delineation. Without the things that he puts on it, the words and whatnot, you might expect it to be an illustration directly out of a automobile catalog, right? You know what that is? I do, because I do that sort of stuff. It's a spark plug, right? Old combustion engines had spark plugs, right? Electronic ignition tends not to, right? But a spark plug is, right? So this is the thing, and again, think about working alongside Duchamp. This is the thing that makes gasoline explode inside of an engine. Remember, the large glass was all about love gas, right? And the bride igniting the passions of the bachelors, right? So again, the ideas that Duchamp is playing with are sometimes often credited to Picabia, because this is I don't know if you have to read French to read this. Portrait of a young American girl. It's a spark plug, right? So again, he's sort of equating machinery with people on the one hand, and that's something Duchamp would do as well, but also equating machinery with love, or sex, I should say. It's probably better than love, right? In the same way that also Duchamp was doing, because remember Duchamp with the chocolate grinder, powering that glider that had the bachelors on it, right? So there's this certain equation between the sexual act and machinery that Picabia, like Duchamp, is picking up on. And for Picabia, it came when he first moved to New York, right? He moves there a little bit in advance of Duchamp, right? And he fell in love with machinery. And he actually said that it's the very soul of modern life, the machine is. The very soul of modern life. And we've seen so many artists. Actually, the right date on this is 1915, by the way. Sorry, I did some research on this today. And it's 1915 was when he did this. So I'm sorry about the 1917 on that. The very soul of modern life. And he's not the only artist that we've seen that has sort of blurred the distinction between man and machine in works from the 1910s. Right? We should think back to the Futurists, for example. Right? Is a really good example, but also artists from the Bauhaus, in particular Oskar Schlemmer, but others as well. Right? The importance of the machine is a metaphor for the modern world. Right? In fact, it's often referred to historically, even by this period, as the first machine age. Right? Where industry has really taken off. And the whole reason they built the Eiffel Tower in the first place was to show off what we could do with engineering and man-made, machine-made materials, right? It was never intended to be there, 5 years later, let alone 130 years later, right? It was to demonstrate the importance of industry to the modern world. And so it became sort of this metaphor for who we are now, right? And how that is different from how our grandparents were when you're in 1915, right? We might point, if today we were finding metaphors, we might point to things like the internet. I was talking to one of your cohorts in the art department today about, she said, what are you going to do when you retire? And it's like, I'm not that old yet, but, and she said, you're going to become a tour guide. And I said, yeah, I could do that. And I was telling the story about when I was long story short, when I was in Brussels, I was trying to stay in Brussels and not come back to America in 2003. Today, you can post something on, you can build a website and say, pay me, Not in 2003. If we were going to point to something that made us different from our parents, it would be internet technology, right? And the whole idea of, even the idea of having an online presence that we talk about, that is a total different way of thinking about our identity, right? So for Pacabia, the machine became this metaphor for how to re-envision our identity, right? So he made, on arriving in New York in 1915, a series of sort of mechanized portraits, if you will, right? Some of them generic like this one, other ones of specific people where he would use a machine to stand in for the person, right? And if we look at the complete title, which you can see, it's a little pixelated there, Portrait d'une jeune fille américaine dans l'état de nudité, in the state of nudity. So he adds, right, even a stronger sort of erotic metaphor to this. This is a naked young girl, naked young American girl, right? And yet it's just a spark plug with the word forever inscribed on the side of it, which itself is kind of, I don't know what he means by that. He'll do that with other images where there'll be a word there that has a very strong meaning, but what it is, I'm not 100% sure, right? So, Pacabia is sort of really getting into this idea of machines as metaphors for erotic attraction, but also as metaphors for our identity in the modern world. Right? So he's come to New York and practicing really a very avant-garde kind of art. I mean, this is really extraordinary compared to what other modern artists are doing. Right? There's nothing really like this on the art scene when Pacabia arrives. Precise drawings of machines where you again begin to question what is art. I mean, when he draws that precisely, could it be traced out of a magazine, right, out of an ad? Is he drawing like a illustrator for a commercial illustrator? Commercial illustrators aren't artists, capital A, right? So he's again, like Duchamp, questioning the idea of who is an artist. What constitutes what art is. It's kind of another found object, isn't it? The spark plug, right? So he and Duchamp are really the most out there people, if you will, around this time, right? They're not just working with abstraction. They're working with ideas that just question everything. And as such, he ends up falling in with about one of the only people in New York that would accept this sort of stuff, which is Stieglitz. Remember Alfred Stieglitz, right? He ran this gallery, Gallery 291, which is the address on Fifth Avenue where the building was, right? And he runs this art gallery, and he is the one New York dealer who is deeply interested in modern art and sees it as his task to help Americans understand what's going on, or at least be familiar with, even if they don't understand it, right? Be exposed to the movements of modern art that we're seeing in Europe, right? And so it is Stieglitz who has the very first show of Cézanne paintings in America. Stieglitz who hosts the very first show of Picasso in America. And Stieglitz who hosts the very first show of Matisse in America, right? He brings these artists to the attention of Americans. And he also has within his circle this group of American modernists that we talked about, a bunch of like Marsden Hartley, right? With those Berlin abstractions. Started off as part of the Stieglitz circle, right? Who else do we look at? Max Weber, right? Those cubist things that look like the Statue of Liberty's head, right? The subway picture of New York, right? These people are also part of Stieglitz has got around him sort of the most forward-thinking artists in New York. And so who else for Pacabia to gravitate toward than the Stieglitz circle, right? And Stieglitz actually then hosts the very first Pacabia show in Gallery 291. Now remember that Stieglitz was also a very, very prominent photographer, a very important American photographer from 1890s onward, right? Really, I mean, if you pare it down, right? If you whittle the list of American photographers down to like 3, one of them is Alfred Stieglitz. I think if you whittle it down to 2, one of them is probably still Alfred Stieglitz, right? He's just an extraordinarily played an extraordinarily important role in the development of American photography, as much as anybody ever, right? You got your Ansel Adamses out there and things like that, and there's some modernists, but Stieglitz is really right at the core of it, right? Beautiful. I really love this photo. I wish I could take a photo that looked that good at night, right? This is just right out the back window, as it says, right? This is from the studio at night in New York, looking out. I don't know which side of Fifth Avenue it was, so I don't know if we're looking towards Sixth or Madison, right? But there you are. Right now, a portrait of a young American girl, was actually published in a journal that Stieglitz published. So in addition to running the gallery, he also has I don't know if it's monthly or bi-monthly, journal that reproduces works of art. Right? This is all part of the agenda of bringing art to America. And the journal is also called 291, right? And the Library of Congress has got like a full run of these. I think the National Gallery has a full run of them as well. And they're very small. They're more like kind of like pamphlets. And each one would be dedicated to a certain artist or a certain movement, and they would have reproductions of their works inside of it, right? And a little bit of text at the back, but not a lot of write-up. It's mostly just about visual. The Journal 291 was like a little printed exhibition, if you will, right? And in 1915, one of the issues, I think it was the July 1915 issue, was dedicated to Picabia. Like only works by, there are like 8 or 10 works by Picabia reproduced in 291. And this was one of them. And these were new works by Picabia that he designed for that issue. So he treated the coverage in the magazine as if it were a little exhibition, right? And the originals were all made with stencils and cutouts and collages. So the words at the top would have been typeset and then sort of set in like a ransom note, not every letter, but words sort of with a sense of being sort of collaged together. So this was one of the pages now in the 1915 edition of the magazine 291, right? And I don't know if that came out at the same time as his show at 291. It might well have. I think they're both in 1915, right? The cover of the magazine is this, right? So it's the 291 magazine. That's why it says that there. This was the cover. And again, Picabia's come from France, right? So he has these French titles, even though he's working in America. And it says, Ici, c'est ici, Stieglitz, foi et mort. And it's signed down at the bottom, Picabia, 1915, New York. And it has two different, again, precisely drawn images that are overlaid, one in red and one in black, right? And the word in Old Gothic typescript at the top, ideal, right? Idéal in French, but ideal. And as to what that is there for, I have no idea, right? There is some ideal out there, perhaps. Is this the ideal? I don't think that's the case, because it's a very satirical picture. This is his mechanical portrait of Stieglitz, right? Stieglitz is a photographer. This is a camera. Right? Do you recognize this old bellows type of camera? They would fold up into a box. They would open up, and that would give your lens the proper distance from the film that it needed, right? The word camera just means room, right? It's a Latin word for room. Germans, right? It's called a Kammer in German. It's a Latin word for room, a camera, right? And so the idea is you're letting light into this little room, right? And without an adjustable lens, which we now have on cameras, right? Focal length, you had to have it be at a particular length from the screen. And it had a very, very small aperture, so you had a great depth of field. You didn't have to worry about focus, right? Just shoot, right? So here's an early kind of camera that we see. The thing flips out and it slides up, but the camera in Picabia's is broken. It doesn't work if light gets into those bellows. Right? So it's folded out. It almost looks like an accordion or something going, off to the side, because it's no longer a working camera. Now, what does he mean? Why does he depict Stieglitz as a non-working camera? This is a question about this picture. But the idea of giving us this precise rendering of the camera is, again, in the spirit of Duchamp's ready-mades, because it's so much like a technical illustration rather than like an artistic representation, right? It's going to put and the thing that it's jumbled with is the red part is an automobile stick shift, an old automobile stick shift. So in older cars, I think you had to move one of the bars for the clutch and the other one to shift, okay? So that's an old, like a Model T gear shift, okay? Cars are, just being mass-produced in the 1910s for sort of the first time. They were fairly rare prior to that, right? This is around the time that Ford figures out the production line, right? So what he's got is a pair of juxtaposed objects, right? A camera and a car brake, or a car gear shift. And we can think back again to Duchamp, right? The idea of putting objects together in a way that makes you question the original use, right? So when we had the bicycle wheel mounted to the stool, now the stool can't be used anymore, nor can the bicycle, right? And you begin to think about the original function and the fact that it's now rendered functionless, right? By juxtaposing part of an automobile, the gear shift, with, and by the way, it's in cross-section too, right? You can see I think it's the pinion is what you call that, down below, the bit that hold where you move it and then what it does to the bit down. You can see it in cross-section at the bottom. But by putting them side by side, neither of them could really work together, right? They're not intended to work together. So what's the point with this, right? Well, the words, right? Ici c'est ici Stiglitz, foi et amour. There's two ways to interpret that, and the way you most usually see is here is Stieglitz. Ici means here. Here is Stieglitz. Folly and love. Right now, sorry. No, so here's Stieglitz, comma, or period, folly and love, just a statement, folly and love, right? Now, another way you could say that it could be translated is, it's here, Stieglitz, folly and love, right? Rather than here is Stieglitz, it's here, right? In other words, folly and love is here. But most people think of it as, this is Stieglitz, foolishness and love. And it comes down to the fact that by 1915, Stieglitz, who had been this great champion of modern art, right, churning out show after show of groundbreaking things that nobody in America had ever seen before, had by the middle of the teens sort of slowed down. He's old. He's been making photos since the 1880s, right? He's not old or anything, but, a lot of his best friends were saying that he'd begun to slow down a bit, right? And so what it seems that Picabia is perhaps saying, jokingly, lovingly, and jokingly on the cover of Stieglitz's own magazine, hey, Stieglitz, the camera's broken, right? You're kind of breaking down. And the gear shift is in neutral, right? It's not engaged in the gear. It's straight up. That's old. Nobody has a gear stick shift anymore, unless you have an older car, right? They're all automatics, but right in the middle is neutral. So it's not in gear. Ergo, it's not moving forward on its own power. It's drifting. And the camera is broken. So here is Stieglitz, right? Folly and love. Still in love with modern art, but foolish. This is his mechanical portrait. And I think Stieglitz liked it, right? I mean, it's on the cover. He's open-minded enough to take that gentle rubbing and sort of play with it and use it himself. So the machine as a portrait, right? The machine as a symbol for modern man, not only erotically, like the young naked girl, but also just for us all. We are all a machine of one sort or another. Got this wonderful gouache drawing, gouache painting by Picabia down in the National Gallery that sort of, again, covers some of the same ideas we've been talking about. sexualized imagery. So, machine tourne vite, machine turn quickly, right? And what he does is he sees the machine, of course, as normal, cogs intersecting, right? And gears intersecting, and a bunch of technical circles around it to give you sort of the proportions of the different parts of the gears, as if it were in fact the design you would find in the technical manual at the factory producing the gears, right? It gives you the sort of construction lines, if you will, for the proportions of the gears traced in yellow around the outside. And each of the two gears are numbered 1 and 2, right? And down at the bottom, by the signature, it tells us number 1 is the female, and number 2 is the male, right? And female, male, right? And what is he showing us here? He's showing us the engaging of the gears of the men and the women, right? And that we are machines, and any kind of coupling you might have is machinery as well. And if you know anything about gears, I only know this from 10-speed bicycles, right? But with a gear like this, and when number 2 turns a quarter turn, right? So if man turns a little bit, woman is going to spin like crazy. You know what I mean? Like he turns 1/4, and the woman, number 1, will spin an entire revolution, right? So he doesn't have to turn as fast as to get her turning faster. There's an erotic metaphor there too, right? And it's kind of odd. It's different from what we normally see, where we see women as are praying mantises. We saw on Tuesday, right? Women are femme fatales and they're dangerous, right? And they're threatening, and here it's like we're controlling them, right? Right? That we have to do just a little bit, and we're going to set the world on fire, right? As opposed to Duchamp, where she's got the love gas that spins the men around below, right? It's almost that turned upside down. And I think it's part of that dialogue back and forth between the two of them. It's not that Picabia, I don't think it's that Picabia is contradicting or wants to contradict Duchamp. I think they're just playing with it, right? Because both of them have a sense of humor about this. 2 quotes. One that's relevant right now. Picabia, it's relevant to this idea they're just playing around on a certain level with these ideas. Picabia said, "Our heads are round, so our ideas can change direction." Right? Our heads are round, so our ideas can change direction. If we were square, they'd bounce into the corner, right? Duchamp, God, just a wealth of wonderful things, but one of my favorites is, "I don't want to get rich making art. I just want to break even plus 10%. That'd be great. Break even plus 10%. Isn't that getting rich? I mean, if I could pay all my bills and have 10% of my income left over in savings, I don't put 10% away at the end of every month, right? Not living in 22207, I don't, right? Anyway, they're goofing off with language, they're goofing off with art, and I think they're deathly serious about the ideas that are behind the things. But at the same time, I don't think we should take anything as a statement of this, that Picabia believes that men control women. I don't think we should go that far, right? Both of them, however, do believe that the machine is this potent metaphor for the modern world, right? And a lot of our Dada artists are there because drawings of machines are things that were not done by capital A artists. And it's part of the agenda, the Dada agenda, to question what is art? What is the value? How do we value art? Is it really, do you have to be Leonardo? Do you have to be a talent like Michelangelo? And this is the question that they're raising, right? That art has other elements. Another artist in the New York circle of Dada artists, friends with both Picabia and Duchamp, and part of that sort of extended Stieglitz circle, Man Ray. Now, Man Ray's a stage name, right? He wasn't born Man Ray. His real name was Emanuel Radnitsky, and he took this name as his sort of artist's name, right? So he's known exclusively as Man Ray, but that's not his birth name, right? And he changed it because he was encountering in the art world and elsewhere a significant amount of anti-Semitism. And so he got rid of his deeply ethnic name and took Man Ray, which also doesn't also sort of sound like the marriage of humanity and machinery, the Man Ray as well, right? That is, he's this, a ray is produced by machines, right? And he's the Man Ray. So that sort of fit some of the ideas we've been talking about. Right? Sorry? It does sound like manta ray as well, but I don't think he's going there with that, right? And unlike Paccabbia and Duchamp, he's a native-born American, right? And so this work obviously shows the influence of Duchamp, right? It also obviously shows the influence of Paccabbia as we see them side by side. But what he's got is some very precisely painted gears, right? So the gears that you see in this that look like they're shiny metal gears are in fact paintings. And these have been sandwiched between two pieces of glass that's cracked, right? And then set into a frame. And then within that, there are also some very sort of precise technical drawings in line that look like maybe schematics, like what we see in Paccabbia's work on the right. And then after he sandwiched them into the glass, broke the glass, he wrote on the outside, Dancer. And he lined the C of Dancer up. So it's very easy to see here that with just the edge of that internal gear, so that it almost looks like a G, right? That you can misread it as danger. And he titles it Impossibility, right? So very much like Duchamp, it's another of these windows you look at versus through, right? A non-functional window. Very much like Paccabbia, very much interested in machinery, so is Duchamp at the same time. And we can see these as being sort of in a satiric dialogue with each other, right? So what Paccabbia gives us is a wheel that turns, that spins the other wheel faster. What Man Ray gives us are gears that don't work. Because a gear system like this will only work with two gears. You put a third gear in and it locks it up, right? So we have two different sets of gears meshing, down at the bottom, up at the top, gold and silver. And in each one of them, they look like almost like clock parts, the inside of a watch or something. But with the third gear engaged, there's no way that any of the gears can turn. So it's, again, an object that doesn't work because of the way the artist has treated it. The urinal, right? The fountain, the bicycle wheel. Objects that don't work because of how the artist has treated them. They no longer have their original utility. And in many ways, a mockery, if you will, playful mockery, of what Paccabbia is doing, right? Machine is a metaphor for sex. Well, maybe this is too. Maybe that's the impossibility. Maybe he sees something, a blockage, there in modern relationships. I'm not 100% sure, right? But that's certainly the impossibility of the title is the impossibility of this machine that he's creating ever working for anything, right? It is simply something that doesn't work. He had a big show in Paris in 1921. He moved to Paris in 1921. And for his opening show in Paris, he made this assemblage, not unlike this one, a sort of box-like assemblage of parts, painted and whatnot. And he called it Self-Portrait, right? And it wasn't a self-portrait, but it had a button to push and some bells. And there was at the bottom, and you push the button and nothing happened, right? And yet he was sort of saying, it was obvious maybe you were supposed to push the button, right? And when you did, nothing happened. Again, machines that don't work, right? that idea of an object that through the artist's intervention is no longer working. Now he's creating them from scratch, right? He's not negating the original use of an object by using it. But he is creating objects that suggest utility and have none, right? And that's what the case of this particular work is, right? Impossibility, the gears that can't turn. Now he adds to that idea of something that can't move, right? There's no way that there is any motion, even though it's implied by the gears. And he adds to the satire of that by calling it dancer. Because a dancer is only a dancer if it moves. I guess we could talk about modern dance performance and stillness and whatnot, but, right? A dancer implies movement. And indeed, Man Ray said that he was inspired by seeing a Spanish dancer with this. Dancers seem to be a motif for him. It comes up again and again in his writings, how he'd seen a dancer and been inspired to do something. But he said he'd seen a Spanish dancer and heard gyrations on stage, right? Sort of gypsy dance. Made him think of gears turning, and that's what inspired him, right? But he locks it down. It doesn't work anymore. And then, of course, in the typical modernist thing, and I think this, again, negates Picabia, which is talking about men spinning women around, by making it dancer danger, right? He brings us right back to that older trope of the femme fatale, right? That there's something dangerous about watching a Spanish dancer, right? Or maybe there's something dangerous about gears that are trying to turn but are locked up. Maybe that's where he's going, right? When you lock up the gears, you've heard of engines seizing, right? When you don't put enough oil in your car and you're driving around with the check oil light on, right? Eventually your car is going to seize up, right? And usually seizure happens when something gets so hot that it grows and it can't move anymore, or something falls in there. Like, have you ever accidentally dropped something inside the garbage disposal in your sink, and you had to go in and get it out, and then you have to turn the thing on the bottom to loosen it, and then you got to pull it out, or you hire somebody to do all of that, right? But usually things will also seize up if something falls into those gears and keeps them from moving, right? And you see this in comedy movies sometimes, right? Somebody's going to fall. They're going to stop it by sticking a broomstick handle in there or something to stop it, right? But when it does seize up, when the engine seizes up, it's still trying, it's still pushing to get those gears to move, right? And usually what will happen in your house, if it's the garbage, is, your breaker will switch off and it'll cut it out so it doesn't burn up or explode, right? But that's the possibility if you've got an engine that's seized and you've got enough power behind driving it, that eventually the teeth are going to shear and the whole thing is going to just explode. And that's a distinct possibility with machinery, right? So Man Ray's picking up on that, right? Here's this gyrations of the Spanish dancer, but it's been locked down, but there's still the energy and there's still the danger, right? Of a dancer that's been locked down, and there's the danger that's going to explode. And that's picked up by the broken glass, right? All adds to that fearsome energy that's bound up behind it, right? So deceptively simple, but full of extraordinary ideas that the more you spend time, more time you spend with it, the more it sort of becomes sort of fascinating. The other thing that Man Ray did was he would often make copies of his works, multiple copies of his works. And so here is significantly later in his career, right, 40 years later, almost 50 years later, a copy, a silk screen, right? So this is a printmaking process where you push ink through a very fine meshed screen, and you can print onto things, either paper or, your Olivia's T-shirt, right? That's a silk screen on there. Or in this case, it's actually to emulate the look of the original. It's been printed onto the back of a piece of plexiglass, so that you're actually looking at a piece of glass with these elements printed on it. And that becomes sort of fascinating because here, Dancer's the last thing he did, right? After he's done with everything, he's enclosed in the glass, and then he writes Dancer on it, or stencils Dancer on it. So it's on top of everything else, right? But if this is printed onto the back of a piece of plexiglass, that's going to be the first thing that goes down. So the printing process for him, I think part of what engages him is it makes him reverse the process that he had done here, right? In order to come up with the exact same thing. I'll finish this and I'll get you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Why did he have impossible at the bottom?
L'impossible, or impossibility, it's the impossible, right? That's the title of the work, right?
Okay.
And it's again stenciled down there at the bottom. So that's the other, right? Impossibility. And in French it's l'impossible, or sometimes it's also written as l'impossibilité, right? Which is hard. Speaking of French, get my mouth around that, right? So the printing process made him anti-arted. Does that make sense? There's a way he constructed this, right? The artist that worked on this worked in a particular direction, a particular series of steps. And in this case, he deconstructs it. He has to work backwards in order to achieve the same visual effect. And the fact that it's a silk screen also infinitely reproducible begins also to question the idea of the artist. Because silk screens have less of they're much more exact from print to print than an etching is. Right? There's a lot less room for sort of mucking it around and making each impression a bit different. Because it's a more mechanical kind of process, right? And that becomes also part of this thing that we've seen with Dada about questioning the role of the artist. Right. Now, Man Ray is best known as a photographer. He's a really terrific photographer. In fact, you know the portrait of Duchamp in drag as Rose Salavi? That was taken by Man Ray, right? And to this day, I think he has a number of really wonderful sort of Dada objects that he made. Strange, funny things. I wish I could show you more. Smithsonian American Museum has got 10 or 12 of them. But he's really well known as a photographer. And eventually moves to Paris. So these photos were made in Paris, right after he had moved there, in 1921. And as he moves to Paris, there are other artists that are moving to Paris in the early 20s. The war is over. People are coming back. Picasso goes back to Paris in the early 20s. We'll look at him in a little bit. Not today, but in coming days. And what happens is Dada spreads to Paris, right? As these Dada artists move there. Man Ray is one of them working in Paris. On the right, one of his most famous photos, Ingres' violin. A woman bather, nude, seen from the back, but through the intervention of the artist, transformed into something else. Transformed into a violin. Now, this work is just hits on a number of things we've hit on in the past, right? Think of how Picasso and Braque were into musical instruments, guitars in particular, right? But, you know, Braque was also into violins. We've seen other artists that have picked up on musical instruments. And we even talked about the fact that when Picasso's using the violin, he sort of sees it as an object that has erotic associations, right? Music itself is a metaphor for love, right? The shape of the violin is similar to the shape of a guitar, similar to the shape of a woman's body, shoulders, hips, and the waist between, right? And playing a guitar for Picasso, right? Like males interacting with women, right? So Man Ray is certainly hitting on that idea by turning the back of the woman into, with the violin sound holes on it, as if she's a instrument to be played. And at the same time, what's Dada about it, of course, is that his intervention, like Duchamp's with the Mona Lisa, right? The intervention makes you then sort of forget about the original, or at least think about it in a different way, right? Dada is very much about these juxtapositions that make you question your assumptions, the things that you're used to seeing. I don't even know how he made the one on the left, right? He's experimenting with techniques that we'll see where he sort of double exposed it. Sorry?
Is it the first mirror selfie?
It is it is. And there's a lot of self-portraits of Man Ray out there. But he understands the camera, and like the constructivist, he's playing with it, right? And what it can do. And it's here, like, it's almost as if parts of it are positive and parts of it are negative, right? So the background looks as if it ought to be dark, but somehow he's made it white, yet he's kept his face with the proper positive negative, right? But the hair and the background and the camera go a different direction. It's a technique he's playing in the darkroom, right? That's why they call it Photoshop. It's because we do it now on the computer as if we were playing in the darkroom, right? But Man Ray was playing with the technology, right? Now, the title of the work on the right, Ingres' Violin, refers back to one of the most famous 19th century artists, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, a neoclassical artist, a pupil of Jacques-Louis David, and a work that Man Ray would have known after moving to Paris in 1921 and hanging in the Louvre, the Grand Bather. And you can see this is homage, right? He puts her hair in a turban, wraps her around her waist with cloth that folds up from it. We see her from the back. We see just the barest hint of her behind, right? Ingres' Violin. So in other words, he's taken an Ingres figure with this photograph as the basis for this photograph and turned it now into a violin. The title also refers to a French idiomatic phrase that he had heard. We have idiomatic phrases as well, but Ingres' Violin was a French term that simply meant someone's hobby. Because Ingres was known outside of painting to fiddle around with the violin. Fiddle with the violin, that's redundant, but you get the idea, right? And so in French it became an idiom, what is your Ingres' Violin? Right? What is your hobby? What do you do when you're not working? Right? What is your plaything? And so this becomes, it's misogynist, isn't it? She's Ingres' Violin. She's a hobby, right? And one could argue that maybe that there's this misogynist statement about she's Man Ray's hobby, and she was, by the way. We'll come to that. But also that maybe photography is his hobby. Maybe art is his hobby. Maybe he's also questioning the idea of art as a profession, art as a serious pursuit, and talking about it more as other terms. He's using a term that leaves open multiple interpretations, right? Now, the model is a professional model named Kiki of Montparnasse, that posed. She was a orphan, began posing for painters when she was 14, posed for quite a few artists in Paris, and by the 20s was Man Ray's lover, right? Kiki of Montparnasse. I think she had also been a prostitute prior to becoming a model, as she was trying to make her way without parents in the tough streets of Paris. So the fact that he calls her Ingres' Violin really does for him mean that she is his hobby of sorts. I think my wife would kill me if I said she was my hobby, right? But nonetheless, here it seems to work in the more open-minded, loose world of Paris in the 20s. With his interest in photography, he also comes up with camera-less photography, right? The same year that Moholy-Nagy did, right? Remember we saw these Moholy-Nagy images, these photograms, where Moholy-Nagy understands that the way a camera works is it lets light into a little box, right, with photosensitive paper in there, and the dark things stay dark on the paper, and the bright things turn the paper white, right? And then you expose it to chemicals. And he realized, Man Ray did, and Moholy-Nagy both did, that you could get rid of the camera. You can just lay things on the paper, turn on the lights, right? And it will expose. And the things that are opaque will leave the paper white. right? So here, Man Ray comes up with the same idea that Moholy-Nagy does, and apparently totally independent from each other. Like within about 3 months of each other in 1921. And they don't know that the other one's doing it. It's utterly felicitous, as near as I can tell. I have not read anybody that's put them together or said that somehow. We know that the first ones that Man Ray put out came out before the first ones Moholy-Nagy did. Right? And he names them after himself, right? Rayographs. And he also, I think, goes a bit further, although they're both doing this, because some of the objects are laid directly onto the photosensitive paper. So the strip of movie film on the right is laid directly onto it. It works just like a negative would in the darkroom, right? And he's also suspending objects over the top of it. So he's got a gyroscope, right? You know about gyroscopes, right? He's got the spinning top on the inside, and once it does, it'll stand on a point, or that point will rest on a string. I had one of these when I was a kid. It was the coolest thing. My dad got it for me when I was like 6 years old. I wish I still had it. Because then we'd put a string across the house, and it would run up and down the string, right? Because it will, as long as that thing inside is spinning, it'll sit upright, right? And he made a number of these, right, with the same gyroscope, laying other things right on the paper. Here's a magnifying glass with, what's that, a needle or something? A pin on it. And then the gyroscope somewhere above it, right, hanging out in between the light source and the paper. Camera-less photography, artless art. Right? This is really, you would argue that Moholy-Nagy is maybe getting close to the Dada ideas here, because how do you know what that's going to look like when you're done? Right? Especially if you've got a gyroscope spinning above it and moving around. How do you know that you've exposed it long enough before it goes into the chemical? Right? How do you know where things go? There's an element of chance that has been a hallmark of Dada works. Right? So Man Ray's rayographs, now produced here in Paris. Right? I think Man Ray's single most famous object that he ever made is the iron with the nails glued to it, gift that he made for this first major show in 1921, the one that had the goofy self-portrait that didn't work. Here's another object, a found object, a ready-made from his experience with Duchamp in New York, a flat iron. Right? You know, back in the day before widely used electricity, you'd put it on top of the stove, heat the sucker up, get a hot pad, and you would use that to iron the clothing, right? And then you'd put it back, and now we just set it to rayon, and we go ahead and iron, and we never burn our clothes, right? But it was much more difficult back in the day. And so this is an iron of the older variety, and he's simply taken it, bought it at a hardware store, and then I think just glued a series of stud nails down the front of it. And of course, what that does is it means you simply can't use it as an iron anymore. It's totally functionless because an iron is supposed to press clothing, make it nicer to wear, and obviously this would just shred anything that you tried to use it on. So it's a purposeless object. One wonders, is that a comment on art? Is art a purposeless object? Is that something they're playing with? Because they certainly do say many times, art is dead, right? Dadaists make non-art. So is there some sort of comment here with that? Well, the gift was stolen. Surprise, surprise. It's called gift, right? It was stolen, and he immediately made another one. And it became so well known that everybody wanted a copy, so he just decided to license the idea and told galleries that it was okay for them to make one of their own and put his name on it. Right? So many of the later series versions of this, Man Ray might have had nothing at all to do with other than the idea. And that's kind of the important thing, right? Going all the way back to the fountain. That for Dada art, the important thing is the idea, not necessarily the execution. Questioning a very long-standing idea about originality. as being a prominent, we still drive this into you guys, right? That originality is crucial for art, right?
It kind of reminds me of the Warhol concept where they just keep it.
Warhol is totally influenced by Dada, right? So when I said at the beginning of class, right, that Dada is kind of everywhere, you can't get past it, right? Jackson Pollock dripping, right? Think of Jean Arc dropping those pieces of paper, right? Warhol making art that doesn't reflect the human hand in any way, making art that's about, that is difficult to authenticate because part of his agenda was to make it so that there's no Andy there, right? And really interested in the way in which the modern world has made us numb to our emotions, right? That's kind of, so this is why he did images of Jackie Onassis, right? Or images of electric chairs, or images of car wrecks, right? And repeated them again and again in silkscreen. That's so mechanized. He's interested in this idea that what has the modern world done to us, our identity? Kavi has already been there. I mean, I love Warhol. I'm not saying he's like second-rate hack ripping everybody else's ideas off, but modern art feeds on itself. And Dada is just, for art of the 60s and the 50s, it is everywhere, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a great analogy, is that idea. The difference is the idea, well, even then, the idea of celebrity, the artist as a celebrity, right? When Duchamp gives up painting to become a competitive chess player, it's just, we're getting there, right? We're getting to that point of sort of, it's not about the work of art, it's about the artist and what they do and what they think about. And then they make it, and there are numerous artists anymore. We heard, when I was in grad school, there was Jeff Koons. I don't know if you've ever heard of Jeff Koons. He's a modern sculptor. Put a bunch of Hoover vacuum cleaners in plastic boxes and put them on display. Right? Floated basketballs in colored water. Made the big, the one you would know is the big chrome bunny that looks like it's an inflatable bunny balloon, but it's chrome and 30 feet tall. That's Jeff Koons, right? Or the image of Michael Jackson holding a monkey that's done in sort of glass. Or the images of Jeff Koons and his wife, who was a porn star, doing it in 3 dimensions. But he didn't touch a single thing with his hands, right? He came up with the idea, make it so. That's coming out of where we are as well, right? So modern art's nowhere without Dada. Really, arguably, this is the most important movement, right? The Beatles. You ever heard of the Beatles? You know the story on Sgt. Pepper? Okay, you know the Sgt. Pepper? Can I go further with this? This is going to be a relevant reference. Okay. Sgt. Pepper, end of side one. Side one, I have it on vinyl, okay? So when you have to turn it over, end of side one is that song called The Benefit of Mr. Kite. It sounds like a circus, right? And it's right before the George Harrison song, right? And it's right after, I think, When I'm 64, okay? And what John Lennon did for that, because he's sitting in the studio all night trying to figure out how to make sounds, and the Beatles are trying to make sounds that nobody's made before, is he took a recording of a calliope, the circus organ, and he made a recording of that, right? And he cut it up into little, like, 3-inch segments, right? Took the actual magnetic tape, and he threw them into a bag, and then he pulled them out and he glued them together. Right? And that's how he got that weird sort of looping sound that you hear at the end of The Benefit of Mr. Kite, right? And how the Beatles also started playing tapes backwards. So in Rain, I think it's the first time they did it, but various places in their career, there are backtracked sounds, right? Tomorrow Never Knows. Lots of stuff off Revolver and Rubber Soul and Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour have back looping, right? And that is also the idea of mucking it around, right? It's like playing with cameraless photography. You know, how can I make sounds that nobody's made before? So it's everywhere, right? It's just, and the list would go on and on with references to French New Wave cinema, right? Nowhere without Dada. Okay. One last Man Ray object. Yeah, we got time. I think we're going to finish Dada today. The indestructible object. The original was made in 1922, again, part of Dada Paris, right? where he's taken now objects and sort of just put them together. He got a simple metronome, right, from a music store to keep time with. And then he has a photograph of an eye, and he cuts out the eye, probably one of his photographs, but I don't know for sure. And he paper clips it to the metronome. And then, it would move. It's a kinetic object. Puts it on display. And the original, in 1922, he playingly, right, jokingly, named it Object to be Destroyed. Now, I don't know what he means by that, in the same way that I don't know what Picabia meant by ideal above the Stieglitz thing, right? I think he's playing with ideas and doesn't want us to know what he's thinking. Object to be destroyed. Well, guess what happened? Somebody destroyed it, right? Somebody took him at his word and took his object to be destroyed and destroyed it. And so he made another one. And the second one he ended up calling Indestructible Object, right? So this is now the second version of that. And I think with all of these reproductions, right, all of these variations, exact reproductions, many times without the artist being involved, right? There are multiple reproductions of this. He doesn't care. We think the reproduction should be worth less. But what Man Ray is arguing, I think, and showing us, maybe even Duchamp is that sense of artistic creation and originality. That where does art begin? What makes art art? And I think that that's such a crucial question in the long run for anybody that's interested in art, because we think that art is the object that you've made. But what they're arguing is that art, that's not where art begins, that's where it ends. That art begins in the mind of the artist. Right? And that the true locus for, if we're going to ask what art is, it's the ideas that the artist is trafficking in. It's the ideas that the artist is trying to get across. Those are far more important than the work itself, is the idea that lies behind it. This is something I didn't understand as an undergraduate art student. This is why I do art history now, right? It's because I made art that looked good but didn't have any ideas behind it, right? I was technically proficient, but I didn't have anything to say. And the great art through all time, right, will always have that, something going on behind it, something going on in the mind of the artist. And that's why we still like it. That's why we still tell you it's worth thinking about. It's because there's some ideas that are coming out there, right? We wouldn't deal with Michelangelo if he was just beautiful, there are ideas there. And what Dada tells us is that those ideas are what's most important. Do I subscribe to this? I like beautiful things too, I like art that's well made, and there's certain things I appeal to visually, independent from any ideas that might be behind them. I love futurist art, and I hate the ideas that are behind it, So, but it's an important question to think about, right? What is the most important thing about art? Right? And the Dadaists are upending tradition that way, right? They're really focusing on the mind of the artist. Well, with Man Ray, we're seeing that after the war, right? So Dada begins during the war. 2 different locations: Zurich, Switzerland, neutral. New York, 1915, when it begins, also neutral, right? We don't get into the war until 1917. So it begins as a reaction against the war, inspired by World War I, and as an artist's attempt to sort of say no to everything in society that they think has gotten them there. And that means saying no to everything, right? Saying no to even art itself. Once the war is over in 1918, Dada continues, right? It has become very, very strong, and it begins to spread into those countries where the war had been fought, where it couldn't spread during the war. So Dada begins to move to Paris. Man Ray moves to Paris in 1921. We also see Dada move into Germany, sort of full force into Germany right after the war, around 1919. In fact, in Berlin, there's a huge Dada outpost in 1919. There's a Dada Club Berlin that opened in 1919. And many of the artists in Berlin that were part of the Dada movement were people we looked at, expressionist artists, like Gross, George Gross, right, was the sort of one of the heads of Dada Berlin. But when we look at the works that we labeled Dada and the works that were coming out of the group from Club Dada Berlin, what we find is that photo collage, right, collages of photographs, often collaged with objects as well, was the primary artistic medium. Now remember, this whole idea of new objectivity didn't come up until 1925, right? These artists weren't called that yet. But they're using works of art, and even the etchings as well, to mock rational society. That's a very Dada idea. And Gross, in addition to making these satiric, caricature-like etchings, is also making collages. And both of them are trying to disfigure the people he shows in order to criticize them. Right? So we're going to look at some photo collages that came out of Berlin. Right? In this case, it's a portrait of the president. Oh, photo collage. Okay, I need to spell it. There you go. Photo collage. Right? In this case, he took a photo of the president of the new Weimar Republic. Friedrich Ebert helped to negotiate the peace at the end of World War I and was then elected president of Germany. He's the one that started the Bauhaus, right? He's the one that the government official who got Gropius to start the Bauhaus, right? He's the one who's in charge of rebuilding Germany after the war, Friedrich Ebert. And what Gross has done is something totally subversive and probably somewhat dangerous, right? Is to take a portrait of him and destroy it. Right? You could probably get away with that today with our president, probably with the past president. There would be some people that you'd be in serious trouble with, right? Especially if you had any kind of profile, right? You're maybe too young. In the 90s, Sinead O'Connor, the Irish pop singer, on Saturday Night Live, stood up and took a picture of the then Pope and tore it up on TV. And she got hell for that. For like years, she got hell for that, right? Gross is doing kind of the same thing, right? He's doctoring up and mocking the president by adding to the portrait, right? He's cut out other people's eyes and put them on there, flipped one of them upside down, added a second set of lips over the mustache, right? Added other things to it that just make no sense whatsoever. Is that a bagel or a bundt cake? Worn as a kind of cute little top. It makes him almost look like he's a bellhop in a hotel, right? That cute little pillbox hat. But it's a bagel that smears over his forehead. Another eyeball on his ear. A knife held at his throat. What would happen to him? Who did it? What comedian? Kathy Griffin, right? Had some sort of horrible beheaded Trump photo that she held up, and she got shit for years for that, right? For doing that. Well, let's imagine this, right? That's an old barber's straight razor. That's the way they used to shave men. I can't even imagine, right? Trying to use it. But then the handle of it, this is totally Dada, right? Is a cigar, right? And then there are these nonsensical Goodyear inner tubes, right? The photos of Goodyear inner tubes, bicycle tubes perhaps, or tire tubes on the other side, that just sort of butt up against his face. Huge question mark right over his forehead, questioning the knowledge of the leadership of Germany. And then there are these buttons that are actually sewn onto it, real buttons, right? So it's this collage of photographs and objects that are jumbled together in a Dada nonsensical way, right? And meant entirely, just like his etchings were, as a critique, right? To turn him into something grotesque as a way of mocking where Germany is going. And that was criticizing where Germany is going. And that's certainly exactly what Gross is trying to do. One of the most famous of these Dada photo collages from Berlin is Hannah Hoch. We haven't seen many women artists in this class, partly because they didn't have the same opportunities as men for most of the early part of the 20th century. But this extraordinary collage, obviously, I would argue one of the best collage artists that ever lived, just because of the choice of scale of things and the way they fit together and the playing with some of the empty spaces and the colors. And it's just, we're only going to look at one, but all of her stuff is really absolutely extraordinary. And then this title, cut with the kitchen knife Dada through the last Weimar beer barrel, you can read it, right? But notice the word Dada just interjected right in the middle of the sentence nonsensically, right? Without any grammatical sense, the word Dada just appears in the middle of the title, right? And kitchen knife, a woman's implement, a kitchen implement. I don't know about then, but a woman's place is in the home, right? I don't know how much men cooked in the teens, but the idea of that is her job is to cut through the beer belly of the government, right? That the government is overfed, over alcoholed, and this is the last Weimar beer belly. Weimar, it's the Weimar Republic, right? She's going to cut through it. And certainly the kitchen knife adds to the idea of what she's doing for collage, which is to cut these things out, right? And as we look at it, we see figures, we see cityscapes, we see maps, we see words, circus animals, and you'll notice that there's a lot of machine parts floating around as well, right? There's a race bearing on the left, some sort of steam device below it, a gear cog in the middle, another gear cog, these dot ideas float around, a wheel, right? A winch at the very top, and then words floating around as well. Many of them are recognizable. So over here, there's Friedrich Ebert again. There's the president doing this, right, with his hands, and he's got another person's eye sort of pasted over to make him grotesque. You know who that is? You usually see him older. It's Einstein, right? Yeah, exactly right. It's Einstein, and again with things pasted over the top of his head. And I love that ant that's crawling out of his forehead, right? A giant ant coming out. And then you see words everywhere, right? Dada at the top. Over on the right, Dada Lecht. Dada lies down. Dada applies, right? In layers. Dada layers. That's probably the best way of saying that. Which is exactly what she's doing, right? Dada layering. And this is ha ha. Look, young man, Dada is no art movement, right? Dada is not an art movement. So this denial of what art is, denying even themselves, and again picking up on the sound of Dada, right? Da 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 down below. Words just sort of interjected within the image everywhere. It's extraordinary, right? There's Katie Kollwitz as the balloon head of this ballerina who's throwing its own head up in the air. Politicians, here's Karl Marx, right? There's Lenin, right? Not John. You talked about the Beatles, right? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. You can identify them all, right? I pointed out the heavy hitters here. Even the donkey's made up of collaged elements, right? It's not just a cut-out donkey. The Great World, the Grosse Welt, right? But Dada splashed right over the top of it. And Dadaists in German here, right? Over here, the ballerina with two heads, that's Gross, George Gross. And with him is another Dada artist who we'll look at next, right? So everybody's here coming together. And again, there's the wonderful collage. Look at those two figures on the right, how they work together. The head slicking as if they're turning to look at us. And then other things that are just, totally grotesque, right? This eyeball turned upside down on the figure here. And then there's this map. And this is I didn't know this at first, I just found this out recently, but that's a map that indicates where women had voting rights in Europe, right? So there's something about it that's also about questioning authority and who gets to say what happens next. Right? So Dada Berlin is using a lot of photo collage as a primary element. But if we think about photo collage in general, not only does it obviously tie back to Cubist works, right, especially synthetic Cubist works, and we've seen other forms of collage before, right? But in addition to that, it really fits directly with what Duchamp started to do with ready-mades. What you're going to do is you're going to put two things together, right, from disparate sources. And by putting them together, you question or even forget the original function, and you start to think about it in a new way. Right? And collage does exactly that, so that the forms that we see, it doesn't matter as much where they came from, whether or not that is Karl Marx, although I think there's some ideas there. Or, what the heck is going on here with our robot man, our screaming robot man with that on his head, right? What matters is that you stop thinking about it isolated in its original use, right? And that art, the intervention of the artist, right? Not art, but the intervention of the artist, right? Makes you think about it differently. And that's why I think Dada is such a great movement, because I think that's what art has always done, right? It is the intervention of the artist that makes us think about the world differently, whether that artist is a poet, whether that artist is a musician, whether that artist is a visual artist. I think that's one of our principal roles as artists, is to get the world to think about things in a new and different way. And Dada highlights that. Okay, we'll wrap up Dada on Tuesday and move on to Surrealism. We're only behind by like a half a day, which is not on the new schedule, but it's not that bad. I've updated the schedule on Canvas for the new due dates I announced at the beginning of class as well. So be sure you look there. And let's see. So over the weekend, you're working on your Surrealism peer edit, right? As well as making some headway on your paper, which is due in a week and a half. And on Tuesday, we'll talk about the paper as well, okay?